economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. We're going to spend some time on our weekend edition looking at a lot of very important issues. Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. He is with the Institute for Policy Innovation, and if you don't know about that organization, 3 of his articles are here today on the website, pointofview.net, so people can probably very easily find their way to ipi.org, can't they? So great resources.
They can, Kerby. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here as well. I might explain why I've been out for a little bit. This time last week, I was in Washington, D.C. We stayed in the Trump Hotel. Hate to admit that, but we were, yes, in the Trump Hotel, and I got to have a preview of the Museum of the Bible. So we'll be talking about that probably next week. And then last couple of days, I've been teaching up at the Kennecott Institute in Missouri. But back in the saddle here, and we have a great opportunity to talk about a number of issues. Of course, Judge Roy Moore is in the news, so we'll talk about that. We're going to talk about some of these tax policies and trying to sort some of that out. Dr. Merrill Matthews has a piece here, how Washington keeps millions from being millionaires, as well as amazing. Democrats are suddenly concerned about the federal debt. And also talk about Obamacare costs more than leasing a Rolls Royce. So those are just a few of his articles. As well, some of you have expressed your concern about some of those tax policies, about whether or not to see if this adoption tax credit should be reintroduced. This is a good illustration of how, because you've expressed your opinion to your elected representatives, we now see that there is amendment coming out of the Ways and Means Committee, which would retain it, and it also be retained in the Senate version. So just a lot to talk about here today. And I guess the first issue that a lot of people have been talking about, Dr. Merrill Matthews, is Judge Roy Moore. The allegation coming out in the Washington Post from one story, Lee Korfman, saying that when she was the age of 14, he preyed upon her. This happened, of course, 40 years ago, so we can talk about both the reasons to believe it and to call for him to step down, and the reasons to be skeptical. What are your thoughts?
Well, we have gone from a situation where people were largely not sensitive to many of these allegations, and now I would say almost hypersensitive to them, in that somebody comes out and makes a claim that happened 40 years ago. As far as I'm aware, Roy Moore does not have a history of this. I mean, we haven't seen allegations that went on and on and on, as we saw with Bill Clinton. And so it is concerning to me. Number one, it's concerning, of course, if it happens. But number two, it's concerning that somebody coming very close to an election, somebody comes up and makes an allegation where that happened decades ago, and we haven't seen a continuing pattern of that. That could introduce a whole new element into our elections if we take those claims seriously without being able to go back and find any real proof of it.
Those so-called October surprises we've had over the years. And I've always said, as I've agreed with John Funn, that, when we have this extended time of voting, that's not a good idea. But one advantage of that is it takes away a little bit of that October surprise. If people are already voting, in this case, of course, they don't vote, I guess, till December.
December, right.
But in other cases, when it's in November, imagine if this was just a week ago and they were actually going to vote yesterday or the day before or something like that. You have these October surprises, and that is, of course, one of the reasons why people have been skeptical. 40 years ago, statute of limitations has run out, but on the other hand, there are reasons to believe it. There were multiple accusers. The women really weren't seeking attention. I mean, if anything, the Washington Post came to them and asked them questions. I mentioned Lee Korfman. She actually voted for Donald Trump, so that kind of sets aside this idea that it's a political hit job. But it is of great concern. And I'm not going to camp on it for too long because we have some other things that will affect all of our listeners. Certainly our listeners in Alabama are going to really have to pay attention to this. The rest of us will look at it and wonder what we can learn from it. But if there's any lesson I want to pass on to all of the listeners here, please do not use the story of Joseph and Mary to justify what may or may not have happened. As many of you may have heard, the Alabama State Auditor, Jim Ziegler, said, well, this is all good because, after all, Joseph was an older guy and Mary was a teen. Please don't use that argument. I know individuals that have written whole columns about how outrageous that is, how that is certainly not helping the cause of Christ. And so if you have thoughts about Judge Roy Moore, and I've already seen the phones ring, so might as well give the phone number, 1-800-351-1212. That's one issue, but I think there's a bigger issue, and that is, if indeed we have had so many of these allegations coming forward, that, of course, changes the political environment. And a good example of that is, you might remember, since we're the old guys around the table, Gary Hart said, hey, wait a minute, who changed the rules? You know, for a long time, people turned a blind eye to whether or not individuals were faithful to their wives. John F. Kennedy is a good example,
right,
and a variety of others. And then all of a sudden, in the late 1980s, they make a big deal about Gary Hart. And I think right now, a lot of people are saying, who changed the rules here? We used to sort of keep this down, but because of Harvey Weinstein, of course, we can talk about GK and some of the others today. There's just so many of these, all going all the way back to Bill Cosby, that have changed the environment. And that changed environment also could change the political landscape.
Indeed, but we'll add another new element in here, which is, we recently found out that apparently the Clinton Foundation and the DNC were helping fund Fusion GPS to do the Trump dossier, which apparently was mostly sort of made up. So you know this goes on in the background because we've just found out about that. And if Democrats were willing to do that against Donald Trump, you have to at least raise the question, are they willing to do that against Roy Moore? And it may not even be Democrats doing it.
Well, and again, these are the kinds of questions that are changing the whole political landscape. And again, for our younger listeners, for just a minute, recognize that there was a time when almost anything was scandalous. I remember, for example, we've had Nick Pitts on the program here, where there was a question, could we elect a Catholic to the presidency? John F. Kennedy.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, 6 out of 9 Supreme Court justices are Catholic. Nobody even probably knows that. There was a time in which, could we elect a president who's been divorced? Nelson Rockefeller in 1964. Ronald Reagan was divorced, wasn't even an issue. There was a time in which, if you've used drugs, that was a debilitating issue. After Judge Robert Bork was set aside, there was a man by the name of Ginsburg who said he smoked marijuana. He stepped down immediately. Then you have Bill Clinton saying, well, I've tried it, but I didn't inhale. And then you later have...
well, remember, you had Jennifer Flowers coming out in the fall of 1992 making allegations about Bill Clinton. And I thought at the time, this probably dooms his election. And in fact, he won.
And again, a lot of things that in the past might have been debilitating aren't now. And that may be good or bad, depending on which issue you're looking at. But at the same time, you can see that we are living in a different political environment. So whether it's Judge Roy Moore or a variety of other people, they're going, wait a minute, where'd the rules change here? I mean, something that happened 40 years ago, maybe I did something really stupid, or maybe he was a sexual predator. You know, either is possible, given the facts that we have here. But the reality is, as you said, it's just changed the political landscape in ways that might be more interesting in the future.
And what we don't want is people being able to come up at the last minute and make false allegations and ruin somebody's career just because they have a political vendetta against them.
Well, we're going to take a break. A little bit later, I might mention, we also will be talking with Cathie Adams again. She's been at the Bonn Climate Conference. And, of course, she has been involved with Eagle Forum, both as an individual at the national level and at the state level. And she's been our eyes and ears, so we'll hear from her. But we'd also love to hear from you. What about these allegations of Judge Roy Moore? 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews with us. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, George Will asked an intriguing question in a recent column. What would America's abortion policy be if the number of months in the gestation of a human infant were a prime number, say 7 or 11? He asked that because we artificially divide the 9-month pregnancy into 3 trimesters. The Senate will soon consider the bill passed by the House that would put additional limits on abortion. Those who are what he calls pro-abortion absolutists are disproportionately Democrats who say they are the party of science. They complain that the Department of Health and Human Services now refers to protecting people at every stage of life, beginning at conception. George Will reminds us and them that this is not a theological statement, but essentially elementary biology. Life begins at conception, and absent a natural malformation or intentional intervention like abortion, conception results in a human birth. In the famous abortion case in 1973, the High Court put forward a trimester policy and only allowed governments to limit abortion after viability, which it stipulated arrives at about 24 to 28 weeks. The current pain-capable Unborn Child Protection Act would restrict abortion after the 20th week. Can we get a scientific answer to the pain question? If the answer is yes, then the party of science should vote for the bill that has been sent to its chamber. Of course, we know that nearly all Senate Democrats will vote against a restriction that exists in most European nations. That is why George Will's column is titled, "Democrats Are the Real Abortion Extremists. Science and medicine are presenting some inconvenient truths to the party of science." It's worth keeping this in mind when Senate Democrats work to prevent even a vote on this bill. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In addition, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. In studio with us today, Dr. Merrill Matthews, and again, he's with the Institute for Policy Innovation, and we have a number of his articles posted, and we will get to those after we do the interview a little bit later this hour with Cathie Adams, because my concern is, of course, we can talk about Judge Roy Moore. That is an issue, especially for people in Alabama, and ultimately an issue for the United States Senate. But what will affect you a lot more are the tax codes and some of the other things we're going to talk about. So we will get into those. But for a few minutes, wanted to give you a chance to express your opinion. Again, the argument comes from the Washington Post. The story that is really the key story is Lee Korfman, who at the age of 14 said he did some things. I won't go into the details. It's a family-oriented program. But then there are other women that have come forward as well. And in this environment, as Dr. Merrill Matthews points out, is this providing an opportunity for op research to then come up with these allegations every time we get close to an election? Mm-hmm. That's a real big question.
It is.
But at the same time...
Because we know it goes on now.
Yeah, now we know it was even funded. But on the other hand, are we dealing with somebody that may have been a predator or a person that made some mistakes or did something 40 years ago? So I'd love to get your comments. And if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll go to Louisiana first. KPAE. Ricky, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby. Nobody's hardly saying nothing about Mendez, and these, had sex with underage girls in the Dominican Republic, but that's okay. He's a Democrat. But when it comes to strong, Christian, conservative, constitutional American, all holy hell breaks out against Judge Roy Moore. And so what if the allegations were true? For the past 40 years, he's been a sterling spiritual, moral giant among American politics. Whatever happened, and of course, I don't believe allegations are true at all, period, to be honest, because you'll know somebody by their fruits. And for 40 years, none of that has happened, and they have to go back 40 years ago. It's just they all hate Judge Warren. Why? Because he's a Christian, and he's conservative, and he's in politics, and he's got a backbone like Ted Cruz. So, that's why everybody hates him. So, but I'm going by track record. For 40 years, nothing has been sterling character or moral, spiritual, a giant in American politics. And they got to go back 40 years. So I believe this is totally made up with George Soros. I guarantee you find some money behind that, paying off these women, by the Democratic Party. Look at Bill Clinton, all the sexual things he did. Oh, I don't know, he's a Democrat, no problem there. But when the conservative
eruptions, yeah. And I think the point that you made, Dr. Merrill Matthews, is an important one, and that is, if you see a pattern, which we have seen, let's talk about Bill Cosby, Harvey Weinstein. You've seen a pattern. If this turns out that we all of a sudden have people that say, well, 10 years ago when he was the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court, he did such and such. Okay, that's a little different. But at the moment, the facts we have on the table, and of course, everybody deserves their day in court. I'm all for that as well. But the facts on the table so far say, yes, 40 years ago something happened, and maybe it was misinterpreted, or maybe he actually did those.
But Ricky brings up a good point. Republicans and Christians are held to a higher standard.
Yes.
And we should be.
I agree with that.
So yes, we are, but we come out saying we live by a higher standard, so we should be held to a higher standard as well.
Yes. Okay, let's take some more phone calls. Again, I know all of you have some opinions on this. A little bit later this hour, we're going to be talking with Cathie Adams. She'll be joining us from Germany. But let's go to Georgia, WAGP Arnice. Thank you for calling today.
Thank you. I appreciate you being on your show. I listen to you particularly on Friday. I really, really enjoy your Friday shows. But the idea that a 14-year-old would not report such an incident to her parents is a little ludicrous. But the coming forth after such a long, long time and trying to prove something, it is ridiculous. I've listened carefully to the previous caller, and I agree with everything he said. I think that sometimes a person may have a tendency to misinterpret what if somebody is in our space. We object to having somebody in our space too closely. But it's the idea that he would be so close to violating this person and then letting her not be violated is a little bit strange.
Yeah, of course, there was at least undressing in a few things, according to the woman, and who knows? I mean, after a while, you do have difficulty sorting that out. But again, on the other side, you have multiple accusers. That's the one thing that starts getting people's attention. You hear Bill Cosby saying, well, that was just a one-time incident. And then when you have 3 or 4 and 5 and 6, 7 other, then you begin, and same thing with Harvey Weinstein. It's like every time we turned around, there was another shoe dropping. So that's another thing to think about.
Arnice touches on an interesting point, though, which is the people related with Harvey Weinstein. These are people actresses, in many cases, who are trying to move up a career. They wanted to be careful about saying anything because they would feel it would damage their career. Yes. 14-year-old probably isn't thinking that, but a 14-year-old could see a power relationship there. Mm-hmm. This person has a lot of power. Maybe I just don't want to go out and say something. Maybe I'm who would believe me anyway? So it's probably not a career-related thing, but it could be something else.
It certainly could be intimidation. So let's take at least another phone call or two. We'll be back on Georgia there on the Good News Network. In this case, Francis, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. Thank you for taking my call. Can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay. It occurred to me, I was noticing in the news that there is a rash of Republican senators, councilmen throughout that are announcing that they are not going to put their hat in the ring and not run again. And this seems to be a pattern. Who knows what, money can dig up a whole lot of people in the past. And it's possible to me, it occurred to me that maybe George Soros' money is digging up dirt on these people, and I don't see any Democrats throwing their hat in the ring. It seems to be all Republicans, and maybe they've had a threat, well, if you do so, if you run again, I'm going to do this, or it just seemed odd to me that all this is happening now, and then we're seeing all these people not going to run.
Well, and there may be some truth to that. When I was just in Washington, D.C., I've heard at least one individual say, a fair number of these people that get up here, and they're talking about men mostly, but sometimes women too, they get up in Washington, D.C., they're inside the Beltway. Again, it's almost like Hollywood where you think the rules apply to everyone else, and they start doing some things that then put them in a compromising situation. So then the leadership can say, you've got to vote with me here, or I'm going to release that information. Or in this case, maybe the opposition says, we have dirt on you, and if you run again, we're going to bring that out in the next campaign and embarrass you and your family.
You remember when Mike Pence made the statement that he didn't go out to dinner with somebody other than his wife? And I can't remember if he said that started when he was in Congress or if that had been earlier. But he got lambasted by the media, the left, and others for that. And I think they were absolutely wrong. In Washington, if you're seen out with another woman, it starts people chattering.
Yes.
You're seen out 2 or 3 times. And it could be a perfectly innocent relationship. We were here, we worked late, we went to get something to eat, and then we're going back to work late again. But that happens there. And so he was cautious about that. He knew what Washington's like. And by doing that, he keeps himself above these kind of accusations.
And again, there is a biblical principle there to be above reproach, right? And he applies that. But it is, again, interesting, Dr. Merrill Matthews, that the values are inverted. Up until recently, we lauded those individuals that sometimes even had those sexual affairs. Remember, a good example would be John Edwards. Remember the vice presidential candidate and the fair-haired boy? I mean, there was a sense in which, we know he was having this affair, even though his wife had cancer, but, we're not going to criticize him at all. So those values were sometimes lauded, and then look who they made fun of, Mike Pence, for doing what is kind of referred to as the Billy Graham procedure of never being in a situation with a person of the opposite sex that then could cause people to gossip about you and hurt your reputation.
Right, because they could take pictures of that if they were in a restaurant or something, take pictures of it. Later, the lady could come out and make some accusations or something. So it was a wise move on his part. He was correct in doing that, and I would argue he's being justified now.
I would say so. So I love the illustration of that, because if you want to find somebody who's right on the issues and certainly has surrounded himself with quality people and also has character, so he's 3 for 3. Very few are 3 for 3. There were a few that were 0 for 3, right? So we know only so well. That's a really impressive. And again, what we want to do is, if nothing else, give those of you that still would like to express your opinion a chance to do so. But when we come back, we do have Cathie Adams with us. She's over in Germany, going to give us one last report from the United Nations Conference, the so-called Bonn Climate Conference. So we'll hear from her first, then we'll come back and hear from you, and also get into some of these tax issues and Obamacare issues. We've got a lot to cover, and we will do so right after these important messages.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was 95 years old, and she didn't tumble into a street. She was forced into it because ISIS was coming. Countless Christians like Sarah are suffering in the Middle East, the birthplace, the cradle of Christianity, and we refuse to pass on by. We urge you to stop with us for just a moment and lend a helping hand to persecuted Christians through the Cradle Fund. Visit pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Our Middle Eastern family needs us. Stop and give right now. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or mail a check with Cradle Fund in the memo to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Weekend edition. In studio with me is Dr. Merrill Matthews, again with the Institute for Policy Innovation. And we have by phone Cathie Adams. For those of you that listen to the program, know that she was on earlier this week when I was in Missouri. It was an opportunity for Cathie to talk with Penna Dexter. A number of articles. President Trump is not pandering to the United Nations. Snowflake state demands at the United Nations. And one today, wind and solar cannot replace coal and gas, but nuclear can. Cathie Adams, if you're not familiar, has served as the Texas Eagle Forum as well as the first vice president of the National Eagle Forum, served as a Republican National Committee woman. And Dr. Merrill Matthews says, good, we're going to be talking about climate and energy. That's kind of another area of your expertise. You've not only written about medical policies, but you've gotten a lot into energy policy, too.
Unfortunately, yes. It's a big issue these days.
So I have two experts here, one in studio, one by phone. Cathie Adams, thank you for all these years. What is it, about the 40th year in which you've gone to one of these UN conferences and been able to survive and tell us about that. So thanks for being our eyes and ears.
Thanks so much. Actually, my first conference was the Women's Summit in Beijing, China in 1995.
Okay.
And by the way,
30 years.
Hello, Merrill Matthews.
Hello,
a band
Cathie.
that I have so much respect for, and certainly on this topic. So I'm looking forward to learning from you even tonight.
Well, let's, if we can, talk a little bit about that.
It's tonight here.
Yeah, it's night there in Germany, Bonn, Germany, and we're here in the Dallas area. And so, matter of fact, some of our listeners are just up in Alaska. It's still daytime up there. It's still morning there. So it's all over the map. But one of the articles that we have here is, of course, the presenter, James Hansen. Once again, we're hearing about climate change. But let me just take the title for a minute. Wind and solar are not going to be able to replace coal and gas. Explain exactly why you wrote it that way.
It was absolutely just blowing in order to see James Hansen, the man who came up with this notion of climate change being caused by human consumption of fossil fuels. And when he came out yesterday with something that made sense, it was like, oh, my goodness, he's saying what we've been saying all along is that nuclear does not produce CO2. And so why don't we use that as a clean energy? Well, today there was another press conference, and the other side of that issue is just lit up like a firecracker. They don't want nuclear energy at all. And so it's a big battle. But the fact is, if you're going to have an energy source that does not produce carbon dioxide, and I'm one of those who doesn't think carbon dioxide is anything but a positive, because it causes our plants to green and plants to even grow bigger. And we actually couldn't even live without carbon dioxide. So everything is cool with that. But these people think it's a problem. And so if they do, then why in the world not accept nuclear power? And the greenies are just out here claiming that no, nothing but wind and solar, even though there is no way in the world that is going to produce enough electricity in order for us to have a good lifestyle.
Dr. Merrill Matthews, wind and solar, I mean, again, these are intermittent sources of power, first of all, and you need something that has more energy concentration, like fossil fuels, don't you?
You absolutely do. The problem is initially the environmental movement, they haven't liked nuclear for decades. They want to go to wind and solar, and maybe biofuels in some cases, hydrofuel in some cases. But they are, as you say, intermittent. They only survive because of U.S. taxpayers. Warren Buffett made the statement about 3 years ago when he was asked about all the money that Berkshire Hathaway, his company, has been investing into wind farms, and he said it only makes sense because of the tax credit that we provide. And the Financial Times actually did an estimate of how much money taxpayers funneled to Warren Buffett in, if I remember right, 2013 to 2014, a little over $1 billion in that year.
Yes.
A billion with a B.
With a B.
In tax credits in order to be able to do this. Warren Buffett makes a lot of money, and he knows how to manipulate the tax system in order to be able to help him make that money.
But, Cathie, if we did not have all those subsidies, wind and solar would look even worse than they look right now, wouldn't they?
They would, and also the man with James Hansen yesterday, his last name is Schellenberger. He is from California, from Berkeley, of all places, and he is the actual leading expert on this issue, and he was invited by Hansen to present. And it was most interesting because he was pointing out the very fact that everything that you're saying and what Merrill Matthews has said is absolutely correct. And so we're just going to have to wait and see how they can maneuver, because I don't think they're going to be able to convince their leftist friends, not with what I've seen today. They're just, as I say, lit up like firecrackers. They're not accepting the fact that this is in their terms, a clean burning source of energy.
You know, France gets a lot of its energy from nuclear power, which is one of the reasons why it has a little bit better record in terms of carbon emissions. Germany was shutting down its nuclear plants because of the Fukushima deal, so they've been moving to coal to try to try to cover them in it.
Right, and what's interesting about that is that their wind and solar have not been able to replace the 7% less energy produced by those nuclear plants that were shut down by the Germans. And so they can't even produce that much. And that's after a $222 billion investment by the German government in renewables. But the Schellenberger, I started to say and lost my train of thought. I'm so sorry. Something about jet lag, I think. But anyway, Schellenberger had even influenced former President Obama to dump $90 billion more into renewables. And so this man was totally on the other side. And then he read this study about Chernobyl and changed his mind.
You know, Cathie, I was in Germany 3 years ago, and as the bus was going through the country, everywhere you go, you see these wind farms up there, windmills everywhere. And I don't know about you, but they seem to mar the country to me. I prefer seeing the pristine country, the fields, the pastures and so forth, having the windmills everywhere. And the windmills are bird-killing machines.
Yes, they should kill all the birds that I love to watch. And again, for people that are saying, well, boy, these figures are coming fast and furious, this article here talks about the fact that Germany invested $222 billion in renewables since 2000, and they've used 4% more solar but generated 3% less electricity due to less sunshine. And even with an 11% increase in wind last year, produced 2% less electricity. So first of all, we're killing all the birds. We're marring the landscape. And we're generating less electricity. Well, that makes sense, right?
All to try to fight carbon increase. And interestingly, NASA came out about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. They've got a new satellite up, looking at where carbon emissions are coming up. They found out that 3 places, the Amazon area, Indonesia, and Africa. And they said this is the source of the greatest increase in carbon that we've seen, much larger than anything else, and it's because of decaying matter in those areas. It has nothing to do with human caused carbon emissions. It was natural processes, and largely gendered by El Nino.
Well, again, we have with us today Cathie Adams, who is, I guess, in Bonn, Germany, and once again looking at this climate conference and has been following that for many years. And so, Cathie, I thought when we come back from the break, we might look at this conference in light of so many that you've been to over the years, because, you know, you have Paris and you have Kyoto, and, of course, you've talked to women's conferences. You've been to so many, just to really begin to talk about what that means in terms of all of our situations. But I was just thinking, both for Cathie and for Dr. Merrill Matthews, we're talking today about something that applies to everybody in the various states. We're right now finding that certain states, just was out in California, where they want to have all sorts of climate control types of legislation. your state, wherever you may be located, may want to think about some of this or may be dedicated to wind and solar. This is why some of these articles and these conferences help you understand this isn't quite the panacea that you thought that it was. So we need to take a break, and when we come back, if you have a comment or a question on these climate issues, we certainly will take those phone calls. We've been talking about Judge Roy Moore. Later on, we're going to talk about Obamacare and the tax policy. So if you'd like to join us on any of those issues, those are also fair game in the second hour as we get back to that topic. And the number is 1-800-351-1212. We mentioned as you go to the website, you'll find some of the articles today. We have a couple of those by Dr. Merrill Matthews that we will get to in the second hour. We have more information about Cathie Adams so that you can find some of her articles and read those as well. So let's take a break. We'll come back and continue our conversation with them, and we'll take some phone calls from you. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
Currently, the House is considering the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. In order for tax cutting to work, we must boost economic growth. The president believes we can get the economy growing consistently at 3% per year by cutting the corporate tax rate. Opponents of such a cut complain that it would starve the government. They ignore the dynamism that would result from cutting corporate taxes. They believe we have to accept the post-recession economic growth rate of around 2% as the new normal. But as the Wall Street Journal points out, business investment is already gaining strength in anticipation of tax reform. The Commerce Department just announced the U.S. economy's third quarter growth rate. It was 3%. This follows 3.1% growth in the second quarter. According to the Journal, rising economic confidence is paying dividends, and companies are betting that tax reform will pass. When even the hint of tax reform is causing this increase in GDP, why the skepticism? Columnist George Will says economists on the left assume the only economic factor affected by cutting corporate taxes is government revenue. But the economy is much more dynamic than that. A recent debate between Senators Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz took the issue to a personal level. A young millennial asked Ted Cruz why she should prefer a plan that cuts taxes rather than raising them as Senator Sanders would prefer. Senator Cruz answered her by saying, "I'll give you the best reason, because when you graduate, you want a job." He explained that jobs are leaving high-tax countries and fleeing to countries who are lowering their taxes. He told her, "We've already got the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world." Senator Sanders' mantra is that corporations are evil and should have their taxes raised. Senator Cruz describes what that would bring, saying, "You'll see even more companies leaving, more jobs leaving. Lowering the corporate tax rate will keep them here." For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio with us today with the Institute for Policy Innovation, and, of course, by phone, as we've had a chance to hear from Cathie Adams, first vice president for the National Organization of Eagle Forum, and has been the Texas Eagle Forum president as well, and was even one of the Republican National Committee women in the past. And Cathie, one of the other articles you've talked about are how snowflakes are making demands And it's almost like some of the individuals at this Bonn Climate Conference have been reading Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals. What are you finding?
Yes, that is exactly right. These children actually now have graduated from college and they are out in the workforce, but they are working for these radical green groups. And they don't know how to reasonably think through situations. Instead, they only know how to make demands. But if someone asks them a question that's too hard, you might see them just kind of curl up in a corner and start to cry. They're a very interesting group of young people. And that was exactly what I have seen. For example, one of these snowflakes called our president 2 names that I took great offense to. And I was not a President Trump fan from the very beginning. But I can tell you this, he is doing the right thing on this issue, and he is doing the right thing in a lot of ways in order to bring America's economy around, to make it a booming economy again. And I'm really appreciating what I'm reading about what he's even doing right now in China. So with all of that said, I do not appreciate having a young person on a dais in a foreign country calling our president an idiot and a buffoon. And that was what I heard.
And there are probably some other words you probably can't use on a family-oriented program that they used off of the dais as well. You know, for a few minutes, I want to put this in perspective, because you have realistically for decades now had a chance to go to these UN conferences, and some of them have been about human rights, some of them about women's rights, a lot of them about climate change and the rest. But this, I think, illustrates an answer that people would not necessarily have come up with, and that is whenever we talk about globalism or the United Nations, a lot of people say, well, there's nothing we can do about all of this. But I'm seeing and sensing this time that because of a president who thinks these through, I might also mention the EPA director, Scott Pruitt. We were just talking about off air. Here's a man now that actually has to have protection because the environmentalists have threatened his life, you know. But individuals taking a reasonable, common sense stand, the whole nature of what you've experienced this time is a little different than what we experienced just a few years ago.
That is exactly right. As a matter of fact, what I have seen by every president since I've been doing this, and that was starting with Bill Clinton in the White House, they have been appeasers. They have always been trying to say, well, you know, you want me to do this, I'll go halfway with you. And it didn't matter if it was a Republican or a Democrat. We were always out to try to appease the United Nations. You know, I was reading a book on my flight over here about the founding fathers and how they had to deal with radical Islam when they were trying to practice free trade in the Mediterranean and off the African coast. And they tried to reason with the radicals. They couldn't. All they could do finally was to build the United States Navy. And it's really sad to see that in order to be liked and in order to not be overly controversial, in order to not sound too strong and too rigid in your thinking, let's appease them. Let's give them something. And for the first time in all of these years, I am seeing a president who stands up and says, along with his transition person, Myron Ebell, and I cannot tell you how excited I was. First of all, when Trump was elected last year while I was in Marrakesh, Morocco, at one of these UN conferences, but then to read also that he put Myron Ebell from CEI in as his transition person for the EPA. It's like, my goodness, this man keeps doing the right thing. He's boldly, courageously stepping out and saying, this is what I promised the American people I would do. By golly, I'm going to deliver.
Well, it's absolutely right, and it's a point you made about we have a long history of this on the Barbary Coast.
Yes,
and the Thomas Jefferson, I believe it was, said we've got to build a navy, and what was happening was the Islamic pirates there were capturing ships, taking prisoners, holding them captive for ransom, and then England and some of the other countries just simply said, well, you know, it's easier to pay the ransom than it is to go and do anything about it, whereas the U.S. said we're going to put a stop to this, and we did. good.
Go to the shores of Tripoli. And, of course, on Veterans Day, actually it's tomorrow, but we're celebrating some of it today. We'll talk more about that in the second hour. But that's where the Navy hymn comes from, right? Because they actually sent the Marines to the shores of Tripoli to fight that. Cathie, before we run out of time, let me just mention that we have some of these articles, but where can people, if they would like to have you come and speak, or if they would like to read all of the material that you've put together, where is a good website to send them to so that they can learn more about some of the things you've experienced this week there in Bonn, Germany?
Thank you for asking. At eagleforum.org, all of the articles that I'll be putting out will be there, and I'm so grateful to you, Kerby, for inviting me to speak, and I'm so extra blessed to have Merrill Matthews there with you as well. But also, I can give out my cell phone number and welcome people to even call me. And it is 972-523-8551, 972-523-8551.
Very good. Well, Cathie, thank you again for being over there in Germany. I know that Penna enjoyed the interview with you on Tuesday. We wanted to wrap that up today, and we look forward to seeing you back here in Dallas.
Awesome. I look forward to seeing you again.
Again, Cathie Adams, and again, the articles, some of which we've already posted previously in the week. For example, the one that came out just a couple of days ago, President Trump is not pandering to the United Nations. You can read those. Of course, you can go to Eagle Forum and find all of those as well. And Dr. Merrill Matthews, if nothing else, we're just learning a little bit more about energy policy overseas, and I know you're writing about it here in the United States.
Yes, and the United Nations. You know, IPI is actually an NGO with the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is a UN body. And we've gone to Geneva several times to participate in that. And one of the things, the good news about the UN is that it accomplishes almost nothing. We give them a lot of money. It's one of those things where you say, thank goodness we don't get what we pay for there.
That's certainly the case. A lot of people have said, you know, we need to take the UN out of the U.S. and we need to take the U.S. out of the UN, but at least right now it isn't costing us as much as it should. But it's still one of those things that, like you said, it's such an ineffective organization. And these conferences, Cathie Adams has gone to these for decades and lived to tell about it, but I'm glad it's her and not me. But let's just, before we take a break, mention that when we come back, we're going to talk about tax policy, the restoration of the adoption tax credit. That, I think, is something very significant. And this piece in The Hill by Dr. Merrill Matthews, when Obamacare costs more than leasing a Rolls Royce. Tell me it's not true.
It is true.
It is true. We will get into that and talk about your taxes and talk about some of the things that are costing you dearly. Let me just mention that we, again, have posted some of these articles by both Cathie Adams and, of course, 3 today by Dr. Merrill Matthews, which I encourage you, first of all, to read and then post them on your Facebook page. I do this, and we post them on our website so that you can read more. And as you go to our website, pointofview.net, to find those, let me mention that we also are telling you and encouraging you about this idea of supporting the Cradle Fund. We recognize that in the past we've been able to raise money to rescue those our Syrian Christians that left the Nineveh plain out of Iraq and Syria. They've been in refugee camps. Now we want to do what we can to restore and return them. We've talked about this earlier in the week, but if you have not had a chance to visit our website, there is a place for you to donate. And this is a gift that will help those who have been persecuted for their faith. So please take the time to join with us and go to the website pointofview.net and make a donation. We'll be back with more right after this.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, in theaters November 17th. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you are homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. If you're just joining us, let's mention a few things. First hour, we spent a little bit of time talking about Judge Roy Moore. That is certainly fair game. Again, if you would like to talk about that. Had some time to talk with Cathie Adams, who has been at the Bond Climate Conference in Germany. Wanted to get an update on that, and we're going to bring her back home, and maybe we can get her in studio to talk about all sorts of issues in the future. This hour, I want to focus on some things that are going to affect you. That is your taxes, the cost of Obamacare, the issue of the adoption tax credit, which was actually removed from the tax plan, now will be added to it. An amendment, according to the chairman of the Ways and Means, Kevin Brady, will be in it and will also be in the Senate. So we'll talk about some of those issues. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Already calls come in. I think these may have been some people that want to talk about Judge Roy Moore, and we will take those. But before we do, Dr. Merrill Matthews, we've posted 3 of your articles, and I love all of your articles. I told you off air how often I quote you when you're not here on the program, and you've seen some of the commentaries over the years where I quote you as well. But this one, I saw it when I was up in Missouri last week, and this was good. When Obamacare costs more than leasing a Rolls Royce. This one comes from The Hill. And I would encourage you to take this article, read it. It's just a little more than a page and a half, or 2 pages if you print it out. And it, I think, illustrates why we need to do something in the issue of health care. Because if you figure out what it would cost to lease a Bentley, an Aston Martin, a Rolls Royce, that's basically what it would cost you for some people to get health care. Talk about that.
Yeah, this was engendered by a friend who is a tax policy expert, lives in Northern Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C., because he does a lot of policy work and consulting and so forth. And he sent me a list of the premiums that he was going to pay for the Blue Cross policy there in Northern Virginia. And I looked at those and I thought, geez, those are awful high. He had 2 HMO options and 2 PPO options.
Right.
And so I thought, well, let me just go out and see how much it might cost to lease a Ferrari or Bentley or some of those. And I found a company in Northern Connecticut which lists these prices that they do for a monthly lease.
You've got them all in here.
And so I put it down there. You've got a Bentley there. You've got a McLaren. You've got a Aston Martin. And you've got a Rolls Royce. And lo and behold, and so the Bentley's actually a little less than the Rolls Royce. But if he wanted to go out and lease and get a gold policy, PPO policy with $1,000 deductible, he will actually be paying more than he would for leasing a Rolls Royce. And it wasn't that long ago that $1,000 deductible was considered kind of a high deductible.
Yes.
And that's for a family policy. These days it's considered low deductible. And, of course, for Obamacare, it's actually considered a very low deductible, because in many cases, people are looking at a $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 deductible. In some cases, they're looking at that per adult in the family. So you could be looking at $12,000 to $14,000. You probably wouldn't be paying $3,000 a month, but you might be paying $1,500 to $2,000 a month. So maybe the cost of a high-end Mercedes.
That is amazing. Now let's go one step further, because in this article, you not only talk about how expensive these are for the Blue Cross Blue Shield Silver level family HMO plan or the gold level HMO plan or whatever, but then once you've spent equivalent to what it would take to lease a Rolls Royce, and you want to say go down to the MD Anderson Cancer Clinic. We actually have an individual just recently that went there, and so MD Anderson Cancer Center accepts all sorts of insurance policies, but it doesn't accept what?
It doesn't accept Obamacare individual policies. So if you're in the individual market and you go out and buy one, especially in Texas, they will not accept any individual market policy from the Affordable Care Act, which MD Anderson is one of the major cancer centers in the world.
Yes.
And this is increasingly true. My understanding is a number of other major medical centers no longer take health insurance from the individual market. Now, if you're in a group policy, you're probably fine. But if you're buying that individual policy, it's a good chance you are not going to be able to go to MD Anderson or many other major centers.
So again, spending $2,500 a month. Talk about sticker shock. And then once you've done that, which is less than if you were to actually lease a Rolls Royce, does not allow you to go to places like MD Anderson Cancer Center and a variety of other places around the country.
Exactly.
So you have nothing to show for it.
Have nothing to show for it.
You know, I remember you've told the story before about your wife as well, being with Blue Cross, and then they actually dropped that policy, and you looked for some alternatives.
Texas Blue Cross, we had a policy that we liked. I mean, $2,500 deductible wasn't cheap, but felt like, we could afford it. Then Blue Cross canceled that policy, saying you're now going to have an Obamacare compliant policy. So we went to that. Deductible went up to about $5,000. Then in the middle of that year, Blue Cross sent out a letter to 367,000 Texans saying we've lost $440 million on that policy that costs so much more with a much higher deductible, and so we're canceling it. So we looked at the other options. Blue Cross decreased the number of physicians in there. She only has one, OBGYN, not able to see that person. So she went to an Aetna plan. Aetna canceled that plan the next year. So now she's gone to the Christian Sharing Ministry.
Yeah. And again, we've talked about that before. Some of these share ministries, whether it's MediShare or Samaritan's Ministries or some of the others. So again, this is an article we've posted here today. When Obamacare costs more than leasing a Rolls Royce. If you wanted a good argument for why we need some health care reform, this is it.
And remember, Obama passed this in order to make health insurance affordable for people.
It's just unbelievable. Let's take some phone calls along the way. I can see we're all over the map here. We talked in the first hour about Judge Roy Moore. We got a call on that. We have one about climate change. Let's go to, first of all, South Carolina, WLPG. Hugh, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
My pleasure. You're a regular on my schedule if I can work it in, and thank you for your ministry. Concerning Judge Roy Moore, I, first of all, think we all know that we don't have a pure past. We've all made mistakes of one sort or another, and it's not necessary that we reveal all of our mistakes to people, and especially when they are part of our past and not part of our current or, repeated events. And if that's the case with Judge Roy Moore, if indeed he is guilty, he ought to be honest and run on his more current lifestyle rather than any past failures. And those of us who are likewise sinners ought to be willing to forgive people in the past if they have made transformations of their lifestyle, and especially those of us who are believers. We need to look in the mirror once in a while and see that if we were to run on our path, we'd fail too. So I don't know whether he's guilty or innocent, but he needs to be truthful and let the truth stand for where it is.
You know, I've said that before, that oftentimes some of the greatest scandals are the fact that it was the cover-up was worse than the crime.
Right.
Be truthful. The American people are pretty forgiving, and to actually speak the truth and to say that was a mistake in the past, I've learned from it, and as you can see over the last 40 years, I have had an impeccable character. I think most people would accept that.
I think that's absolutely right.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break. We have a lot more phone calls, and we're going to get into a couple of other issues. How Washington keeps millions, including you, from becoming millionaires. All of a sudden, Democrats all concerned about the federal debt. What about these tax policies? We got a lot to cover. We'll do that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You know, George Will asked an intriguing question in a recent column. What would America's abortion policy be if the number of months in the gestation of a human infant were a prime number, say 7 or 11? He asked that because we artificially divide the 9-month pregnancy into 3 trimesters. The Senate will soon consider the bill passed by the House that would put additional limits on abortion. Those who are what he calls pro-abortion absolutists are disproportionately Democrats who say they are the party of science. They complain that the Department of Health and Human Services now refers to protecting people at every stage of life, beginning at conception. George Will reminds us and them that this is not a theological statement, but essentially elementary biology. Life begins at conception, and absent a natural malformation or intentional intervention like abortion, conception results in a human birth. In the famous abortion case in 1973, the High Court put forward a trimester policy and only allowed governments to limit abortion after viability, which it stipulated arrives at about 24 to 28 weeks. The current pain-capable Unborn Child Protection Act would restrict abortion after the 20th week. Can we get a scientific answer to the pain question? If the answer is yes, then the party of science should vote for the bill that has been sent to its chamber. Of course, we know that nearly all Senate Democrats will vote against a restriction that exists in most European nations. That is why George Will's column is titled, "Democrats Are the Real Abortion Extremists. Science and medicine are presenting some inconvenient truths to the party of science." It's worth keeping this in mind when Senate Democrats work to prevent even a vote on this bill. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. First hour, we spent a little bit of time talking about Judge Roy Moore, and we certainly can take those phone calls. We also talked about the issue of climate change and energy policy with Cathie Adams. We mentioned how Obamacare now costs, at least for some people, more than leasing a Rolls-Royce. In a minute, we're going to get into the tax issue because the tax reform package could limit how workers are allowed to deposit tax-free in their 401ks and some things like that. Going to talk about the federal deficit, talk about the different plans, also the issue of the restoration of the adoption tax credit. A lot of issues that we want to get into today that people want to know answers about, and we're privileged to have Dr. Merrill Matthews sitting across the table from me. But let's take another phone call or two. First of all, Bob in South Carolina, thank you for joining our conversation today here on Point of View.
Thank you. I appreciated being on the line. I was just listening in to the comments on Judge Moore. What I hear is the assumption of guilt. If he did do this, he needs to come forward. Let's back up. He has a right to face his accuser. If we want to look at our laws, you're innocent until proven guilty. So let's find out what the real truth is before you even say, well, if you're guilty, you need to apologize and move on. I mean, that's a disparagement of character in a very subtle way.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
Yeah, and the point I would make is that, first of all, probably will never be a court case because, as I understand the statute of limitations, so he may never get to face his accuser. It will never be a court case. So we're sort of left with this, it's all going to be kind of hypothetical. But I think your point's well taken. I mean, you are innocent until proven guilty. You have the right to face your accusers. You have a right to have your day in court. And it reminded me of something that we talked about before the show began, and I forgot to mention that. There was an individual in the Reagan administration, Ray Donovan, who served as the Secretary of Labor, and he was accused of fraud and a number of things, and then he was vindicated. And his
by
a jury. And his question that he asked back in the 1980s even rings through this situation today. And he said, where do I go to get my reputation back?
Right.
You kind of think, Bob, where does Roy Moore go to get his reputation back? Because there's never going to be a way that he would be cleared, even if he went to court. And there will always be then the Wikipedia entry or the entry in the bio that skeptics will do that he was accused of, whether that was true or not.
And I think Bob raises a really good point. If somebody had come up and said 40 years ago, Roy Moore broke into my house and stole some money or something like that, people would look at that very skeptically. But we've sort of transitioned over to if somebody makes a claim about sexual assault, and this is promoted and also by Hillary Clinton, who said one time during the campaign when somebody asked if somebody challenges, if a woman makes a accusation like that, she said she should be believed. And then, of course, they came, well, what about your husband? Well, unless they're proven false, which was never actually the case. But it's Bob has the point of somebody makes this claim, and it's almost immediately sort of assumed that the claim is true, and it may or may not be true. You don't want to disparage or make it hard for women to bring forth claims that are true. But on the other hand, you want to be very careful about just assuming that if a claim is made, that it's going to be true. And Bob's point, I think, is these ladies have made this, it's automatically kind of assumed that it was true, and it may not be, or it may be somewhat different than what they're claiming.
And, of course, all the Republican leadership, not all, but most of them are saying that he needs to step down. So, Bob, again, he's already been convicted in the court of public opinion.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's what you have covered every point that I wanted to bring. It's kind of like the old lawyer saying to the guy, when did you stop beating your wife?
That's a good point. Yeah. Bob, thank you for calling in and bringing needed corrective in that regard. And again, just back to Ray Donovan for just a minute. He's not the only one. Casper Weinberger and others. During the Reagan administration, there was mud thrown at almost everyone, including Ronald Reagan himself. And you, after a while, say, where do I go to get my good reputation back? Because at least if you are a national figure, or Ronald Reagan, or even a Casper Weinberger, you have a kind of public opinion. You still have that court of public opinion. Who in this listening audience even remembers the name Ray Donovan? Yeah. Or if they accuse you or me of something, where do I go to get my good name back?
And Kerby, the new twist to this is we now understand the media is sometimes complicit in this. Remember the charge of, was it rape at the University of Virginia?
Yes.
And Rolling Stone, I believe it was. And now that's been come up to be proven false. And it was the Rolling Stone that sponsored this. It created huge media attention, backlash, and so forth. And eventually it came out to be a false story.
Well, again, we'll continue to take some of those phone calls on that. Along the way, we'll talk about the tax plan and a couple of other issues, because even though Judge Roy Moore really only affects, in a sense, those of you in the state of Alabama, it affects all of us because that might be the 51st vote in some respects. And so we'll keep looking at that. But we also have spent some time talking about the issue of climate change and energy. So let me go to South Carolina this time. Dennis, WLPG. I think you want to address that issue.
Yes, I do. Thank you very much, Kerby. Everybody knows that our seasonal climates are a result of the Earth's axial tilt. And if people would examine the nautical almanac and look at June 21st, the sun's angle on the summer solstice, they would find out that the Earth's axial tilt is actually slowly decreasing each year. In my 1984 almanac, the tilt was 23.44 degrees, 442 degrees, and in 2016, the tilt had decreased to 23.435 degrees, and that equates to about 25.2 seconds of a degree decrease in axial tilt.
Sure. You know, and Dennis, back to your point, is whether it's the tilt of the Earth or the solar cycles, because the sun sometimes is hotter than others, that's, I think, the explanation for a lot of the climate change. I mean, there was a time in which you had what was called the medieval warming period. And so that certainly had to do with solar cycles. You're talking about another one, and that is a slight variation in the tilt or the orbit or all sorts of other things. These are all things to pay attention to instead of just focusing on carbon dioxide.
And the ocean oscillations. You have El Nino or La Nina. We're moving back into a La Nina right now. But that's not, and that will affect the jet stream and affect what part of the country is warmer and drier and cooler and wetter. But that's not the only one. There is the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation. It's called the AMO. There is the Pacific decadal oscillation.
Yes.
PDO. Both of those have been in warming phases, and they surround the Arctic. And I actually sent a note off 2 or 3 months ago to a climate scientist in, I think, the University of Colorado, saying, you've got this, you can check it out. It's warming water around the Arctic. Shouldn't that have an effect upon the ice melt that we've seen in the Arctic at various times? And he came back with a long answer, including another oscillation that I'm not aware of. And it came out saying, we're not sure that it has an effect on it, but it looks to me, when you look at the thermal maps around the Arctic, they're in warmer, and nobody really understands these oscillations. The PDO changes every decade or so. The AMO actually changes every multiple decades, and they're both in warming phases right now, and nobody really knows why.
Yes. Well, and again, you pointed out that a lot of the carbon dioxide coming is from decaying matter. And, of course, the real question I had when we were in graduate school at Yale, I remember we saw what looked like a correlation. We'd see the CO2 going up, and we saw the temperature going up. But then the temperature didn't keep going up. But we always thought that carbon dioxide was the cause. And I began to think maybe it's the effect, because as the Earth warms, 3/4 of the planet is water, that is oceans, and as you warm those waters just a little bit, it releases more carbon dioxide. So in some respects, maybe over these years, we've been looking at the effect rather than the cause.
I've seen graphs that plot them out, and it does appear that the warming precedes the carbon dioxide increase. But the Earth has been warming since the last ice age, and that's not human caused. It's one of the trends that's been going on.
Well, again, you remember your geography. Iceland doesn't have ice, and Greenland has ice. But interestingly enough, there was a time when Greenland did not have ice, and the Vikings did very well. There was a time when they actually had all sorts of vineyards in England because it was much warmer in England. So to say all of this is due to SUVs and coal-fired plants, I think is really missing the more complex issue. And you, again, reminded us of how much more complex it is with La Nina and El Nino and all these other kinds of things in the Atlantic. So let's take a break. When we come back, we'll take some more phone calls. Well, a lot of phone calls here today. And, of course, you can address the issue of Judge Roy Moore, climate change. We're also going to talk about some of the things in this tax plan that could affect you in a positive or negative way as a family. So we're going to get into that as well. And we are privileged to have in studio with us today Dr. Merrill Matthews. He is with the Institute for Policy Innovation. Please take the time to get some of the articles, go to their website and benefit from that, and post a few of these. If nothing else, post the one when Obamacare costs more than leasing a Rolls Royce. Unbelievable. We'll take a break and come back with more right after this.
You're riding down the road, and just ahead you see an elderly woman tumble off the curb into the street. As your friend drives past, she prays, "Lord, please send someone to help that poor woman," and drives on. What if that was your mother or grandmother? In Christ, our family includes people like Sarah. Sarah was 95 years old, and she didn't tumble into a street. She was forced into it because ISIS was coming. Countless Christians like Sarah are suffering in the Middle East, the birthplace, the cradle of Christianity, and we refuse to pass on by. We urge you to stop with us for just a moment and lend a helping hand to persecuted Christians through the Cradle Fund. Visit pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. Our Middle Eastern family needs us. Stop and give right now. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or mail a check with Cradle Fund in the memo to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Some of you want to talk about Roy Moore. We'll take those calls in just a minute. Some of you want to talk about climate change. That's certainly fair game as well, because those are topics we addressed in the first hour and are continuing taking some of those calls. But I also wanted to educate you on the tax plan for just a minute before we get back to the calls. And one of those pieces by Dr. Merrill Matthews, who's in studio with us with the Institute for Policy Innovation, has to do with the 401k plans. Another one that we've talked about as well is this whole issue of the adoption credit, which I think is a good illustration of how, because a number of conservatives and Christians, including people at Breakpoint Commentary and others, have said, we want to retain that is now going to be restored. But let's talk about these tax plans. We have a Senate bill that, of course, is going to be a little different than the House bill. Takes from 7 individual tax brackets down to 3. But your piece here, how Washington keeps millions from being millionaires. You ask a very good question. Where are all the defenders of the 401k plans when it comes to the topic of reforming Social Security so that it operates a similar way? And you point out that there are ways in which individuals listening to this program, especially if they're younger individuals, could end up actually retiring as millionaires if government didn't get in the way. Explain.
Absolutely. Yeah, what happened was initially the House was considering limiting the amount of money that you could put into a 401k plan, and as a way to try to save some money so that they could help, in other words, pay for their tax reform.
Right.
And that got all these financial columnists out there talking about how great 401ks are. I agree with that. But the issue is whenever you talk about taking Social Security, which is bankrupt, and letting people in essence put their own money, instead of putting in Social Security, putting it into their own retirement account and letting that grow, has some safeguards on there. People couldn't day trade with it or anything. But you get people saying, oh, that's the worst idea. People would day trade, they'd lose money, the stock market goes down, it's a terrible idea. And I said, well, why aren't you people who are defending 401ks, which operate essentially the same way, defending private Social Security accounts? Because they typically don't. There's just a handful of us who do that.
Yes, and again, the point is that if you were to take the same amount of money that is deducted from your paycheck every single time you're paid and put that even into a interest-bearing account, you would be better off than what you have right now with Social Security, wouldn't you?
15.3% of your payroll, half paid by the employee, half paid by the employer, goes to the federal government. Most of that goes to Social Security. Part of it goes to Medicare. And yes, if we were able to put that money into our own retirement account, then it would be our money and it wouldn't be the federal government's. They're supposed to have something like $7 trillion set aside, but that money has all been borrowed.
Yeah, it's just a IOU in there, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So again, that's one of those articles, again, that you might want to read, how Washington keeps millions from being millionaires, including you. You know, you younger people, we do our Millennial Roundtable Wednesdays. I would need to do a Millennial Roundtable just where he says, look, if you just to set aside a small amount, at your age, you will have an opportunity to retire very well. One of the other articles I want to mention before this whole bank of phone calls ringing is answered is the issue of adoption. And that is, here's a good example of the fact that sometimes you wonder whether Congress is listening. Well, in this case, they were listening because it came out, as you know, Dr. Merrill Matthews, that you had the adoption tax credit, which has been in the current tax plan, which was removed from the House version. Well, because, and the article I've got here, the adoption tax credit was restored because of a conservative backlash. And John Stonestreet has written about that in Breakpoint Commentary. I think we've mentioned it here. We were even thinking about gearing up to have some kind of action item. Well, they've heard you, and so they actually are going to have an amendment, according to the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, Kevin Brady, that will actually replace that, and it is also in the particular Senate version. And National Right to Life is a good example because, if anything, if we believe that adoption is better than abortion, anything we can do to encourage adoption and prevent abortion is a good thing. So it's not only a wise thing in terms of families, it's certainly a very definite pro-life initiative that took place.
And one of the things that Congress has been trying to do is figure out how are we going to pay for this tax bill.
Of course.
Because they had estimated roughly $1.5 trillion over 10 years. It's a lot of money, and they'd like to be able to reduce that cost. One thing they had considered was eliminating the mandate to have health insurance.
Right.
Initially, the Congressional Budget Office had said if you eliminate the mandate to have health insurance, that saves $416 billion over 10 years. Now, as Republicans were looking at doing that, the Congressional Budget Office came up and said, well, we don't think that mandate's as effective. Probably won't be nearly as much savings. Wait a minute. You're saying now, it sounds like you're actually becoming political, giving us a higher number when we wanted to do it earlier, but now that it would actually offset tax savings and so forth, you're giving us a lower number to help fight tax reform. So the director of the Congressional Budget Office said, we are looking at changing how we estimate this, but we don't want to get political, so we're going to keep our old method, but we're still only going to say it's going to save $338 billion. Still a lot of money over 10 years.
Right.
And yet it looks like they're not going to, at least right now, it doesn't look like they're going to do that. I would love them to eliminate the mandate. It pays for roughly 20 to 25% of the cost of the bill, and it would mean that people out there who want to buy something other than other than what Washington tells us we have to have, could do it without facing a penalty.
And again, we have people calling in here all the time and say, look, I am forced to buy a policy that has such a high deductible, and I am so healthy that even if I were to eventually qualify for that, I'm just paying for something I know I won't use. And in the past, I had one that covered for catastrophic, which I remember you used to say, these high deductible catastrophic plans are really good. And there were people, and at least on the Democratic side, that would criticize you when you'd testify for that. Now that's the kind of policies that we have that nobody can really ever use except when they have just a horrible catastrophe that comes in their life.
One of the most expensive elements of a health insurance policy is drug and alcohol abuse counseling.
There you go.
Apart from the standard
and if that's a mandate,
hospital insurance and so forth. And a lot of our listeners, I suspect, don't need drug and alcohol abuse counseling in their health plan. I don't. Yeah. And so if I could eliminate some of these mandates that Washington thought I ought to have in there, my health insurance premiums might be a little more affordable, but it wouldn't be qualified, and I would face the penalty.
Well, again, lots of issues on the table. So let's, if we can, take a few of those issues. And if you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'll go to Alabama. Since we've been talking about Judge Roy Moore, got at least to hear from somebody in the state of Alabama. So, Ken, you have the floor. What would you like to add?
Thank you, Kirby. After spending, some people said $20 million, and I did hear a $30 million figure to try to defeat Judge Roy Moore against his Republican opponent there, Luther Strange. Why am I not surprised at what they're doing now, since they didn't beat him off in the previous runoff? My phone here rang so much I got to where I wouldn't answer it because there were so many political calls.
Yes.
And I got so many full-color, glossy photo postcards of Luther Strange in the mail. If I wanted to see Mr. Strange's picture, I could just reach over and pull my high school annual from the late, great Shades Valley High School here in Birmingham. He was 1 year ahead of me.
How about that?
I did not know him personally, but I was mainly calling to tell you that check out the front page at Infowars.com on the rotating pictures there. One article says, Photos Moore Accuser, a Democrat activist. Accuser had worked closely with the Hillary Clinton campaign, and you can see this person, Debbie, what is her last name? Gibson. Debbie Gibson is out front of the podium signing to the audience, sign language, and you can very clearly see Hillary Clinton in the background with a microphone addressing the audience. So she apparently has worked very closely with the Hillary Clinton campaign, so why am I not surprised?
Yeah, Debbie Gibson. Lee Korfman, who is part of the Washington Post article, said she voted for Donald Trump in 2016 So, again, we'll just kind of figure out.
On the other hand, Donald Trump was not for Roy Moore. He was
for sure.
They were doing. That doesn't necessarily mean she would be for Roy Moore.
That doesn't necessarily mean anything other than at least she's not a Democratic operative, but the other one apparently is. So, very good point. We need to take one of those mandatory breaks, and I've got a lot of phone calls, so So when we come back, we'll just churn through those as quickly as possible. But let me just again commend to you our good friend here, Dr. Merrill Matthews. We mentioned earlier when Obamacare costs more than leasing a Rolls Royce. And then this one, how Washington keeps millions from being millionaires. So those are a couple. And also one that I've posted we really haven't talked about, but I guess shouldn't surprise you. All of a sudden, Democrats are suddenly concerned about the federal debt. You know, it's amazing how they didn't seem to be very concerned when it was Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, but really become more concerned, especially under George W. Bush and now under Donald Trump. I've always been concerned about the federal debt, but it's amazing how the Democrats kind of have vacillated on that.
We stay concerned about it.
$20 trillion, how can you not be? But at the same time, let's see if we can get some economic growth. And as Penna Dexter's commentary you can hear right now is on the line, you will see that we've had 3% growth. And the way to grow your way out of some of the deficit is to stimulate the economy. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
Currently, the House is considering the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. In order for tax cutting to work, we must boost economic growth. The president believes we can get the economy growing consistently at 3% per year by cutting the corporate tax rate. Opponents of such a cut complain that it would starve the government. They ignore the dynamism that would result from cutting corporate taxes. They believe we have to accept the post-recession economic growth rate of around 2% as the new normal. But as the Wall Street Journal points out, business investment is already gaining strength in anticipation of tax reform. The Commerce Department just announced the U.S. economy's third quarter growth rate. It was 3%. This follows 3.1% growth in the second quarter. According to the Journal, rising economic confidence is paying dividends, and companies are betting that tax reform will pass. When even the hint of tax reform is causing this increase in GDP, why the skepticism? Columnist George Will says economists on the left assume the only economic factor affected by cutting corporate taxes is government revenue. But the economy is much more dynamic than that. A recent debate between Senators Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz took the issue to a personal level. A young millennial asked Ted Cruz why she should prefer a plan that cuts taxes rather than raising them as Senator Sanders would prefer. Senator Cruz answered her by saying, "I'll give you the best reason, because when you graduate, you want a job." He explained that jobs are leaving high-tax countries and fleeing to countries who are lowering their taxes. He told her, "We've already got the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world." Senator Sanders' mantra is that corporations are evil and should have their taxes raised. Senator Cruz describes what that would bring, saying, "You'll see even more companies leaving, more jobs leaving. Lowering the corporate tax rate will keep them here." For Point of View, I'm Penna Dexter.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Dr. Merrill Matthews in studio. Let's take some phone calls. We'll go to Peoria, WPEO in Illinois. And Stan. Stan, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks for taking my call. As a corn and soybean farmer in Illinois, I have a perspective on climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And since the Earth has been here 6,000 years, there's only been accurate weather records for about the last 120 years.
I'm not even sure they have them yet.
Yeah, that's conceding a point that we may not want to concede around the table.
Yeah, well, anyway, in the farming community, there's a one-word definition for climate change, and that one word is weather.
Weather. Yeah, the unpredictability of the weather. You know, when we try to get some estimates in the past, like I've talked about the fact that we've had an ice age and we've had a medieval warming period in some of those, you have some records. Sometimes you have ice cores and things like that. But Stan, here's a good example. You're a farmer. I'm sure you watch the weather every night. I'm married to a farmer's daughter. We always have to watch the weather report every night on the news. You know as well as I do that it's like throwing darts on a dartboard some days, because just one change in the front or one particular high or low, and what was predicted to be rain becomes sunny. What was predicted to be a nice day becomes a windy day. We know only so well. We can't predict it 24 hours from now because of all the variables necessary to have a climate change model that's fairly accurate. So then to predict what's going to happen 100 years from now, how in the world is that even possible?
Oh, nobody can know. You know, it's interesting. Back when I was in college, 1975 or 76, Time magazine had a cover story, and it said the coming ice age.
Yep.
We remember that. Yeah. We're the old guys around the table. We remember when they were predicting global cooling.
Yes, indeed.
Not global warming. Yes. Right. Not so long ago.
Yeah. So anyway, if people get out here in the country, they get a whole different perspective of what life's like.
You know, in the Farmer's Almanac, since you're a farmer, you probably read that a few times. My father-in-law, I should say, and of course my grandfather too, both read it all the time. And sometimes that was as accurate as anything I've seen, which just, again, was looking at long-term trends.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, years ago I was watching Rocky and Bullwinkle on TV on the Rocky show, and they went and visited the local meteorologist, and he was standing there at a dartboard throwing darts, preparing his forecast for that evening.
So I guess my illustration was a good one. Well, Stan, thanks for calling today.
Yeah, thank you. Okay,
keep farming and keep listening. You know, but again, you have looked at this, Dr. Matthews, for quite some time.
You're talking about Rocky and Bullwinkle?
Yeah, maybe not Rocky and Bullwinkle. Although, there we go. And Natasha and Bullwinker and all that. Yeah, okay. But anyway.
Boris
and Natasha. I couldn't think of the other name. But what we are dealing with is just so many variables. And I've done computer programming when I was in graduate school. And even one variable that is off or one factor that you did not consider, and your computer model is basically worthless. And since we have so many dynamics happening simultaneously around the world, it's just hard for me to believe that we can develop a model that will work.
You know, I was at a climate science conference here a few years ago, and an elderly gentleman stood up who was involved in this, and he said, I don't know why we do this, because we know the climate models are just no darn good. They're just no darn good.
And that's coming from somebody in the business, right?
And like economic models. Remember when Barack Obama passed the stimulus package and all the benefits? That was based on an economic model. You put these inputs in, and then you get out these returns, and if it's a lot of it's based upon your assumptions about things and things you can't control or don't know about.
Yes, well, we all have used the old phrase GIGO, garbage in, garbage out.
Garbage in, garbage out.
That's what I was saying. Let's take a few more phone calls here. We'll go to Georgia. Dave, thank you for joining us. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Yeah, thank you, Kirby. I'm a little bit nervous. I'll try to make it concise. Well, I lived in a foreign country for about 2.5 years, and it was whoever gets to the police first is innocent.
Oh.
Oh, yeah. And in other words, in our country, it's innocent until proven guilty, because anybody can accuse anybody of anything. What these folks are doing, they're just reputation assassins. It's totally un-American and totally un-Christian.
You know, and also I wonder about what is going to happen in the future, because there are people looking at this right now and say, you know, I've led a pretty good life, but there's maybe something in my past that somebody could dredge up. So I'm not going to actually engage in public service, and we leave out some really good people from the opportunity to serve in our government.
It's getting even harder. If you're going to run if you want to be a Supreme Court justice,
oh goodness,
do you want to go through that? And Kathleen Hartnett White, I believe, was getting grilled here in the last day or two because she's going to be at the EPA, I believe. Scott Pruitt is nominated for something. And do you even want to go through something like that? But Dave brings up a really good point, which is we don't know whether the accusations against Roy Moore are true or not, but there are reputation assassins out there who exist to take money to try to find ways to assassinate your reputation for political reasons.
Well, and again, the example that you used, because people tune in and tune out, is a good one, and that is the Russian dossier, which was an attempt to really ruin the reputation of Donald Trump. We now know who paid for that.
Yes.
So, again, just a good example of that. Just before we run out of time, let me mention that we've posted a lot of your articles, but there was one that I did not mention, but I would encourage you to read, and it's written by our good friend David French. We need to get him back on again. Behold the free speech hypocrisy of the corporate left.
Oh, yes.
Now, the point he makes is this, that on the one hand, you have Tim Cook, who is the president and CEO of Apple, who received this wonderful award from Newseum, the Free Expression Award, and so they really want to, in a sense, talk about free expression. But even so, that Apple and Google and others sometimes have said, you know, we will still take offensive language or mean-spirited ideas off of our website, like the corporate flag you can't buy on the Apple Store anymore. Okay, got that. But then they turn right around and say, but we simply cannot allow the head of the Masterpiece Cake Shop to actually make a decision about whether or not he would actually, as a cake artist, make a cake for same-sex marriage at a time which, by the way, Colorado didn't even have legalized same-sex marriage.
You know, when I saw that piece, the notion struck me, if a neo-Nazi group went into a bakery and said, we want you to make us a cake, we're having a party, we want to have lots of swastikas on this, we want to have a hand raised like a Heil and so forth, and we want to say something bad about Jews on there, and even if they'd gone to a Jewish bakery, we want you to make this for us, and the bakery said, we're not making something like that, they would have been praised by the left.
Yes.
And rightfully so, maybe. But, I mean, you do it from a Christian standpoint, and you get criticized.
Well, certainly
and challenged, and laws being made against them.
Well, again, one of the things we've been watching, and our good friend Dennis Prager has done a number of things on Prager University and talking about how Google censors. On the one hand, we say, look, it is a private company, whether it's Google or Amazon or Apple or whoever it might be, and they can make decisions about what they offer on their website, what they offer in terms of products or services or whatever. But at the same time, they're also using the internet, and so I have a little bit of concern about the First Amendment issue here. But when they then are just as hypocritical as they can possibly be and say, we're going to decide what we're going to allow on our website, but we are going to file an amicus brief against Jack Phillips, or we're going to vilify Jack Phillips because at Masterpiece Cake Shop, he just couldn't bear to produce a cake for these homosexual couples, when he's turned down others, you know, the individuals that were like for strip parties and things like that. You just see the hypocrisy of the corporate left right now.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, again, that's an article we've posted on the website. We didn't talk about it today, but I did mention it. And again, if you'd like to know more about the Institute for Policy Innovation or Dr. Merrill Matthews, go to our website, pointofview.net, and find those resources. One last time, don't forget that if you'd like to contribute to the Cradle Fund, it's available on our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday.
Affirm Films and Sony Pictures Animation present The Star, the fully animated story of the first Christmas, told through a whole new set of eyes. Bo the donkey and his stable of animal friends follow the star to become some unlikely heroes.
That light, that's the star. This is where it's been leading me. What's his name?
His name is Jesus.
The Star, in theaters November 17th. More information is available at thestarmovie.com.
If you were homeless and on the run, all because you love Jesus, would you want Christians to step up and help? Our family in the Middle East, the cradle of our faith, is in desperate need because of ISIS and other persecutors. Point of View urges you to support the Cradle Fund today to help these precious believers. Please give at pointofview.net/Cradle Fund or call 1-800-347-5151. pointofview.net/Cradle Fund and 800-347-5151. Or write Cradle Fund in the memo of your check to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that. Thank you for that.